On a sweltering Mississippi night, an enslaved woman named Sarah made a decision that should have been impossible. In a world built to break her, she chose fire. By dawn, her master's house was ash. He was dead, and more than 200 enslaved men, women, and children were gone vanished into the darkness, chasing a freedom most of them had never even seen. Was she a murderer, or a liberator, a criminal, or a general in a one-woman war against slavery? Tonight, we step into her shadow. If stories like this shake you, challenge you, or make you think differently about history, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. It helps more people discover the hidden lives of those history tried to forget. The night didn't begin with flames. It began with silence, the kind that settles heavy on the skin, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath. The plantation house stood tall in the darkness, smug in its power, a monument built on stolen lives. Inside, its owner slept without fear. Why would he fear anything? He believed the people he owned were too crushed to imagine rebellion, too exhausted to dream of freedom. But Sarah was awake. Some say she moved like a whisper. Others say she walked with purpose, as if every step had been rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. What we know for certain is this: she carried fire, and she carried a decision that would change the lives of everyone on that land. She moved toward the house as if drawn by something ancient: rage, grief, love for her people, or maybe all three woven together. The lantern's flame trembled in her hand, but Sarah didn't. She had seen too much, survived too much, to tremble now. When she reached the wooden steps, she paused, not in hesitation, but in recognition. This house had been her cage, her torment, her reminder that every breath she took belonged to someone else. Tonight, she intended to reclaim it. The fire touched the walls almost gently at first, like a greeting. Then it grew. It found dry beams, old timber, oil, fabric, and it began to speak in crackles and snaps. Sarah didn't run. Not yet. She watched. She listened. Inside, the heat woke him before the smoke did. A shout, half fear, half disbelief, tore through the night. But by then the fire was already a living thing, devouring everything it touched. That was Sarah's moment. She turned away, finally running not from guilt, but toward the tree line where nearly 200 enslaved souls waited in the dark. The signal had been given. Freedom had begun. History rarely gives us the luxury of a full picture, especially when the person at the center was an enslaved black woman in the Deep South. Sarah's life wasn't recorded with dates or diaries. It was recorded in the shadows, in whispers, in the fragments that survived despite a system built to erase her. We don't know her exact age, but accounts suggest she was young, somewhere between her early 20s and early 30s, old enough to understand the world's cruelty, young enough to still believe in a world beyond it. Her days likely began before sunrise, with labor that ground down the body and the spirit, cooking, washing, carrying. Many what enslavers called woman's work, but what was really survival work? She would have been expected to serve without pause, without rest, without complaint, and yet, she thought, she observed, she learned. What makes Sarah extraordinary isn't simply the fire she set, it's what must have come before it. Imagine the emotional calculus she lived with every day, the fear of punishment, the constant threat of violence, the possibility of being sold away from anyone she loved. Enslaved women bore a double burden, oppressed for their race and objectified for their gender. Sarah would have known all of this intimately. She might have lost children to the auction block. She might have endured violations no record will ever name. She would have watched people around her break under the weight of a life they never chose. But something inside her refused to bend. She didn't see herself as hopeless. She saw herself as responsible. And that single shift, seeing herself as an actor, not a captive, was where resistance began. Some say Sarah was quiet, the kind of woman people underestimated. Others say she carried a fire in her eyes long before she carried one in her hands. But everywhere her name appears, even in hostile sources, there's one detail no one disputes. She was a leader, not by title, but by gravity. People trusted her, enough to follow her into the night. To understand Sarah's choice, you have to understand the world she lived in, a world designed to crush the possibility of rebellion long before it took shape. Plantation life in Mississippi wasn't just hard. It was engineered to be soul-breaking. Every rule, every schedule, every punishment was part of a system meant to convince enslaved people that resistance was pointless. Days began in darkness, not dawn darkness. Before the sun rose, people were already in the fields or kitchens or workshops. their labor stolen before they even had a chance to greet the morning. Overseers patrolled with whips, dogs, rifles, and authority backed not just by the plantation owner, but by the law, the church, and the state. Survival required silence, obedience, predictability. But deep beneath that forced quiet, something else lived, beneath the routines meant to erase individuality. Enslaved people carved out slivers of humanity wherever they could. A whispered joke in the quarters, a stolen moment to teach a child a song from a homeland they'd never seen, a shared glance that said, "I see you. You matter," but none of it erased the brutality. Families could be torn apart without warning, sold off to another county, another state, another world. A mother could put a child to bed and wait to find them gone forever. Religion was weaponized. Sermons preached obedience and loyalty to the master, twisting sacred words into chains. And the law didn't just fail enslaved people, it condemned them. Escape meant whip scars. Resistance meant death. Yet somehow, hope still flickered. Hope survived in the smallest corners of life because it had to. You can only bury the human spirit so deep before it pushes back. And on plantations like Sarah's, that resistance often began as nothing more than a thought. This isn't how things should be. A thought like that is small. Until the right person decides to act on it. Rebellions don't begin with fire. They begin with a moment of crack in the wall of fear big enough for courage to slip through. For Sarah, that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It grew slowly, like a seed forced to push through hard, unforgiving earth. She would have witnessed things that carved themselves into her memory. Overseers who punished people for working too slowly. Children beaten for crying. Women dragged into barns and emerging changed, quieter. She would have watched loved ones disappear down dusty roads, sold to settle debts or fund expansions. Every injustice was a spark, tiny, a dangerous dot, and Sarah collected them not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't look away. Defiance often starts in the smallest gesture, so small most plantation owners never noticed them. A tool accidentally broken to slow the workday. A whispered prayer spoken not to the master's God, but to ancestors who remembered freedom. A stolen moment of teaching someone to read, even though it meant lashes if discovered. Sarah would have absorbed all of it. The quiet sabotage, the coded songs, the looks exchanged during Sunday gatherings. These weren't random behaviors, they were the early architecture of resistance. The blueprint for something bigger. And Sarah wasn't just watching. She was learning who could be trusted. Who listened. Who was brave. Who was ready. Because whether she knew it yet or not, her steps were leading her toward a decision most people wouldn't dare dream of. Some say the final spark was personal punishment to harsh, an insult to cutting, a loved one harmed beyond repair. Others believe Sarah had simply reached the edge of what any human soul could bear. Whatever the trigger, one truth is clear. Something inside her shifted from enduring to acting. And once that shift happened, there was no turning back. How do you plan the impossible when you have no maps, no weapons, no written notes, and betrayal could mean death? You do it the way Sarah did, quietly, patiently, with a mind sharper than any overseer ever imagined. People underestimate how much strategy lived in the quarters. Every night, once the workday ended and the plantation went still, conversations slipped into coded language. Songs weren't just songs, they were messages. A hum could mean wait. A pause could mean listen. A certain lyric could signal tonight is not safe. If Sarah was the spark, the others were the tinder. But coordinating nearly 200 people, that took more than bravery. It took genius-level timing. One misstep, one loose word, one frightened person confessing under pressure, and it would all collapse. But it didn't, which tells us Sarah wasn't just bold, she was brilliant. The plan likely formed piece by piece, hidden within everyday routines. Maybe Sarah noticed which nights the overseer drank too much. Maybe she tracked when the master slept deepest. Maybe she memorized patrol routes or learned which enslaved men could slip through the dark. Without making a sound, she wouldn't have gathered everyone at once, that would be too dangerous. Instead, she would have spoken to small groups, quietly, when no one else was near. A hand on an arm, a whispered phrase, a look held 1 second longer than usual. Word would spread, not like gossip, but like a promise, hope carried carefully, passed from person to person, and somehow, with risk hanging over them like a blade. They said yes. All of them. Imagine that level of trust. The escape route itself had to be memorized landmarks disguised as everyday scenery. The leaning oak, the split in the creek, the abandoned shed nobody used anymore. each one a breadcrumb toward freedom. By the time the night of the fire arrived, everything was in motion, everyone knew their role, everyone knew the signal. All that remained was courage. Fire is unpredictable, alive, hungry, impossible to fully control. But on that night, it was the only weapon Sarah had, and she wielded it with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. When the flames first caught, they were quiet, a soft flicker, a glow licking at the edges of the house. The master slept through it, unaware that the world he thought he commanded was already slipping out of his grasp. But once the fire found the dry beams in the kitchen and oil stored nearby, it grew vicious. Heat rolled outward like a wave, glass cracked, smoke curled through hallways. By the time shouts erupted from inside, it was already too late for Sarah and the others. That sound wasn't horror. It was the signal. As the house lit up the sky, the plantation exploded into chaos. Overseers rushed toward the fire, shouting orders, grabbing buckets, scrambling to save the only thing they valued, the property. In the confusion, no one noticed the shadows slipping away from the quarters. No one noticed nearly 200 people moving as one, hearts pounding, breaths shallow, eyes fixed on the tree line. Some held children. Some carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some whispered prayers. Others stayed absolutely silent, replaying the plan in their minds step by step. Sarah didn't lead from the front or the back. She moved through the group like a steady pulse, making sure no one fell behind. The fire behind them roared louder, smoke painting the sky red and black. It was now or never. Just beyond the last fence line, someone hesitated, a child crying, a woman tripping in the dark. Sarah doubled back, lifting them to their feet, urging them forward. Behind them, the house collapsed in a thunder of sparks. Ahead of them, only darkness and the faintest taste of freedom. The doorway had been opened. Now they had to survive walking through it. The first hours after an escape are the most dangerous. Fear sharpens the senses, but exhaustion dulls the legs. 200 people slipping through Mississippi darkness. It wasn't a march. It was a miracle. They stuck to the woods, keeping off the roads where patrols rode horseback, lanterns swinging. The trees swallowed them, turning the world into a maze of whispers and footsteps. Insects hummed. Branches snapped under hurried feet. Somewhere far behind them, the plantation still crackled and hissed under dying flames. But freedom wasn't a single moment. It was a direction. North. Always north. Some walked barefoot, leaving blood on the earth. Some carried sleeping infants pressed tight to their chests so the cries wouldn't give them away. No one complained. No one slowed. Everyone understood the stakes. By dawn, the air grew colder. The adrenaline that carried them through the night began to fade, replaced by hunger and the painful stiffness of bodies pushed past their limits. Still, they couldn't stop now for long. Slave catchers would already be mobilizing. Bloodhounds would be tracking. Every mile mattered. There were moments of near disaster, twigs snapping too loudly, a lantern's glow passing too close, a child stirring with a whimper that could shatter the fragile cloak of silence. Each time, the group tightened instinctively, like a single organism fighting to protect itself. Somewhere among them, Sarah kept watch. She didn't need credit or recognition. Her presence alone steadied people. When she whispered, "Keep moving," they did. When she murmured, "Quiet now," silence swallowed them. And when someone stumbled, she was the one who reached out a hand. As the second night approached, the group slipped into a swampy lowland, miserable, wet, mosquito-filled, but safe from horses and dogs. There, for the first time, they allowed themselves to breathe. Not relax, just breathe. Exhaustion weighed heavy, but something else flickered to die: hope. Sarah looked at the faces around her and knew they had come too far to turn back now. If you open most history textbooks, you won't find Sarah's name. You won't find the fire. You won't find the daring escape of 200 enslaved people. And that silence isn't accidental, it's intentional. For centuries, the stories of enslaved people who resisted were erased, softened, or twisted into warnings. Plantation owners didn't want future generations to know that enslaved women like Sarah fought back with strategy, intelligence, and unbreakable courage. Writers of the time described her only in the coldest terms: a slave woman, a dangerous girl, a domestic. They recorded the fire, but not her motives. They noted the escape, but not the brilliance behind it. They condemned her, but never mentioned the brutality she lived under. History recorded the property damage. It ignored the humanity. Even when fragments of Sarah's story did survive, they came through the voices of people who feared her. Newspaper articles from the era used sensational language, calling her wicked, treacherous, or unnatural. Think about that for a second. An enslaver could torture human beings, sell children, destroy families, and still be considered respectable. Yet a woman fighting for her people's freedom was labeled a monster. Other details were deliberately blurred. Was it exactly 200 who escaped? Some reports say 160, others say a great number. Were all of them from Sarah's plantation? Possibly not. Word of resistance spreads like wind, and nearby enslaved people may have seized the moment. But this uncertainty doesn't weaken her story. It strengthens it, because when oppressed people resist, the powerful rewrite the narrative in real time. And yet, despite all attempts to silence her, Sarah's story survived. Not perfectly, not neatly, but through scattered records, whispered family histories, and the sheer impossibility of forgetting. A woman bold enough to defy an entire system. She wasn't a myth. She wasn't a rumor. She was real. And her erasure tells us everything about the kind of woman she truly was. When you reach this part of Sarah's story, the questions start to get heavier. A man died the night she set the fire. That's a fact. And whenever death is involved, people begin drawing lines, labeling, judging, trying to decide whether someone was a hero or a villain. But here's the uncomfortable truth. History isn't a superhero movie. It's messy, complicated, human. Sarah didn't act from a place of power. She acted from a place of desperation, trauma, and decades of violence that left her with almost no choices at all. Her master wasn't merely unkind. He owned her, controlled her, had legal and physical power over every breath she took. So the question becomes, can someone truly be called a criminal in a world where their humanity was criminalized first? Some argue she saved lives, hundreds of them, and not metaphorically. If those 200 people had remained on that plantation, most would have died in bondage. Generations of children would have been born into the same suffering. Sarah's act was violent, yes, but so was the system she fought against every hour of every day. Others argue she crossed a moral line, that in choosing fire, she chose destruction. That killing, under any circumstances, must be condemned. It's a viewpoint rooted in principle, but it's a principle rarely applied evenly. Because when enslavers used violence, the world called it discipline. When enslaved people used violence, it became rebellion. The moral playing field was never level, not even close. Maybe Sarah wasn't a hero or a villain. Maybe she was something far more human, a woman pushed beyond the limits of suffering, who chose freedom not just for herself, but for everyone around her. A woman who refused to die enslaved. A woman who demanded a future at any cost. And history still struggles to define people like that. More than a century and a half later, Sarah's story still vibrates beneath the surface of our world. You can feel it in conversations about justice, resistance, and the right to fight back when the system refuses to see you as human. Her act wasn't just a moment in 1800s Mississippi, it was a spark that echoes across generations. Because the truth is, Sarah's struggle didn't disappear when slavery ended. Its shadows linger in mass incarceration, voter suppression, racial violence, and the ongoing fight for dignity and safety. When you hear activists today talk about freedom, autonomy, or the right to defend one's life, you're hearing the same heartbeat that carried 100 people into the night behind her. Sarah didn't just free bodies, she freed an idea. Today, scholars look back at women like Sarah and recognize something that earlier generations refused to see: leadership. Not leadership born in classrooms or boardrooms, but leadership shaped in fire, fear, and impossible choices. Sarah was the kind of leader history often overlooks: black, female, enslaved, and yet capable of orchestrating a resistance that changed hundreds of lives. Her story forces us to rethink what resistance actually looks like. It isn't always polished speeches or organized marches. Sometimes it's a single decision made in the dark, a refusal to accept the world as it is, a moment where survival becomes revolution. And what makes Sarah's legacy powerful is this: she never asked to be remembered. She acted because she had to, and sometimes that's the purest form of courage. When we say her name now, Sarah, we're restoring something the world tried to erase. We're acknowledging that freedom has always had a cost, and that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices when pushed to the edge of survival. Her story asks us one final question: what will we do when we're asked to choose between comfort and justice?